Our next speaker is already here in the studio, so please welcome Gennadii Kazakevych. Nice to meet you.
Hello, Simon. Nice to meet you too. Hello.
And Gennadii is Ukrainian best and most known expert in the unusual for Ukrainian archaeology topics. So we are very welcome him here, and please share your talk with us.
Thank you so much. And first of all, I'd like to express my gratitude to all people of goodwill who support my country in any possible way. And here in Ukraine, we very much appreciate it, and we need this support so much. So my presentation is devoted to the Iron Age Celts and their influence on the territory of today's Ukraine. And we will talk about this topic in terms of classical studies and archaeology. So let's start. The lands of present-day Ukraine were stretched across the distinct periphery of the Celtic world. And the only region of the present-day Ukraine where the Latin culture was sufficiently widespread is the Transcarpathian area, which lies southwestwards of the Carpathian Mountains. The undulating terrain with its mild climate provided excellent conditions for cattle breeding and farming. And the wetlands of the Upper Tisa basin offered large sources of both iron ore and charcoal, which were used in the Iron Age metallurgy. During the 7th, 4th centuries BC, the Upper Tisa basin was occupied by the Kushtanovitsa culture, which is most frequently associated with the northern Thracians. In the 3rd, 2nd centuries BC, the cultural situation in the region changed radically. New technologies of house building, pottery making, and metalworking were introduced in the Upper Tisa area, and new centers of economic and political activities emerged. There are more than 20 sites of the Latin culture in this region of Ukraine, and the most notable of them is the one located on the Galesh and Lovachka hills near the modern town of Mukachevo. It was a large rural settlement that had no significant fortifications. However, it was also a major center of craftsmanship, especially bronze and iron working, which was involved in long-distance trade with other Celtic centers of this region. The local blacksmiths acquired raw materials from the nearby area and probably from the specialized center of metallurgy in Nove Klinove, which consisted of working grounds with remains of about 200 of forges, slag, and iron aggregations. And here we can see the picture of excavations which were provided by Vasil Bidzila in this area in the early 60s. It is highly likely that Galesh Lovachka was not just a production, but also a political center of the local area. The traces of the coin minting, as well as some characteristic findings of military equipment, such as the short sword with an X-shaped handle, long slashing swords and iron chain belts, horse bits and chariot fittings, give a lot of reasons to suggest a presence of the Celtic military elite on the settlement. There is no doubt that there were also some sanctuaries in the nearby area. There are some findings of the Celtic coins with characteristic chop marks, which are typical for many cult centers in the Central Europe. And some bronze figurines come from the votive deposit in Malabigany, not so far from Galesh and Lovachka hills. In the 1st century BC, the Celtic settlements of the whole Upper Tisa area declined due to the military activity of Dacians and their leader Burebista. It is not clear when the Latin sites of the Transcarpathian area were abandoned exactly, but we know that at least some of them survived the Burebista's raids in the mid-1st century BC. The Latin technological achievements influenced the Dacians significantly. So during the next few decades, a syncretic Celtic Dacian culture with a center at Malakopania Hillfort emerged. It is rather a complicated task to define how far-reaching was the Celtic expansion in the lands eastward of the Carpathian Mountains. Since the late Hellenistic period, some classical authors who followed Posidonius as their main source invented the term Celtocytaeans to describe the Celts and Cytaeans who met and mingled in the North Pontic area. And it is highly likely that this mixed barbarian population was also known to the classical authors as the Bastarne. In this part of my presentation, I'll try to show that the Greeks and Romans were actually right, at least in terms of their own categories and concepts. There was indeed a group of population in the lands of today's Ukraine, Poland, and Moldova, which combined some Northern European, Celtic, Balkan, and probably some local cultural elements. And this group emerged due to the cultural transitions in the basins of Dniester and Vistula rivers between the Baltic and Black Seas. We should start with the terms Scythia and Scythians, which were even less scientific and more artificial cultural constructions than the word Celts, which we use to write in quotation marks by now. As Herodotus pointed out, the so-called Scythians never used this ethnic term as a name to refer to themselves. Nevertheless, the Greeks used the name Scythians to label various groups of nomadic, semi-nomadic, and settled tribes which belonged to different linguistic groups and obviously shared different cultural identities. One should pay attention to a purely geographical character of the term Scythia, and now it is widely associated with the nomadic royal Scythians of the Black Sea littoral. However, for many classical authors, especially for those who belonged to the Posidonius tradition, the Scythia extended far to the north. According to Strabo, it occupied the most northern part of the world, which ended at the Northern Sea. At the same time, Diodorus Siculus notes that the rich in amber island Basileia is situated directly opposite the part of Scythia which lies above Galatia. And some scholars identify Basileia Island with Helgoland, which lays to the west from Jutland in Atlantic. Anyway, it is important to stress that the classical authors, at least those of the Hellenistic period, considered the southern littoral of Baltic Sea as a part of Scythia. The 3rd century BC was a period of crisis and power vacuum in the North Pontic area. At this time, both narrative and archaeological sources demonstrate a penetration of some groups of newcomers from the west in this part of Eastern Europe. First of all, the Greek epigraphic decree in honor of Protogenes informs us of the military activity in the northwestern Pontic area. It mentions the Galatai and Skiroi military union threatening Olbia and nearby Scythian tribes. The date of the decree is uncertain. It could reflect the events of either the second half of the 3rd century BC or the early 2nd century BC. The question of who were Galatians mentioned by this document largely depends on its date. Most probably the Skiroi, who were the allies of the Galatians, belonged to the same ethnic entity as Skiri, an Eastern Germanic tribe located somewhere in Vistula Basin, according to Pliny the Elder. So it seems more likely that both groups of invaders, Galatians and Skiri, came from the north rather than from the south. Meanwhile, Claudius Ptolemy, who used the sources dating to the turn of the millennium, mentions some clearly Celtic-looking ethnic and place names in the Eastern Europe, far enough from the area of the Latin culture. Let's have a look at the archaeological context of all those mentions in written sources. If to speak about the Celtic presence in the lands of today's Ukraine, one must admit that the situation differed significantly depending on the region. To the east of the Carpathian Mountains, there are very few pure Latin settlements or burials. One can mention the small settlement and pottery workshop in Bovshiv, Upper Dniester area, and two cremation burials, Zalisia and Vyshchetarasivka. Such complexes may probably be considered as traces of the micromigrations of craftsmen, mercenaries, and women involved in matrimonial links. There are also a lot of isolated findings of the Latin jewelry, coins, and military equipment. They can be divided into two major groups: the early to middle Latin and the middle to late Latin imports. Most of them are concentrated in the upper Dniester and middle Dnipro basins. It is clearly visible that the earliest Latin artifacts in the region had their prototypes in Thrace. These include the double spring brooches of the Pastrup type, also known as the Pauken Feeble type, which were produced extensively in Seutopolis and Zboranovo in Thrace until the middle of the 3rd century BC. One should also point out the findings of the lead coins from the Dniester estuary. The most probably belong to the rare type of coins which was produced in northeastern Bulgaria in the 3rd-2nd centuries BC by mixed Celtic Thracian population. Special attention should be paid to the oval shield and sword with an X-shaped handle representations on the coins of Leukon II, the ruler of Bosporan kingdom. We don't know exactly why he started to mint coins with the images of the Celtic-looking military equipment. However, one can find very similar depictions on the coins produced by the Greek colonies of the West Black Sea littoral that have paid a tribute to the Celtic king Kavaros. In general, it seems clear that the increasing quantity of the early and middle Latin artifacts in the lands eastward of Carpathians and the emergence of the oval shield representations in the Bosporan kingdom all coincide with the rise of the Celtic military activity in the Balkans. However, this period didn't last too long, and even if there were military raids of the Celts from Thrace into the North Pontic area, they seem to have no significant impact on the cultural development of the region. Dramatic changes came in the early 2nd century BC when the Przeworsk, Poyaneshti, Lukashivka, and Zarubinci archaeological cultures emerged in the lands of Eastern Europe. And unfortunately, there is a kind of a problem with my slides because I can't see the drawings of the borders of those archaeological cultures, but there are my writings. So the Przeworsk culture was located somewhere here. And Zarubinci and Poyaneshti, Lukashivka in the territory of today's Moldova. All three cultures are sometimes called de-Latinized because they combined the Latin and Jastorf traditions in their aspects of material culture and ritual practices. The bearers of those cultures are often identified with the Bastarne, a tribal group that, according to Greek and Roman sources, emerged in the northwestern part of Pontic littoral by the early 2nd century BC. The Bastarne are known for their invasions of Thrace and Illyricum, as well as for their resistance to Roman expansion. Titus Livius makes a note that the Bastarne were related to the Celtic Skardiski. That's interesting because the Zarubensi culture bearers used to wear the Middle Latin fibula with the triangular stem ending. Outside of the Zarubensi culture area, similar fibulae are known only in the lands of Skardiski. The Latin influence is also evident in the funeral rite and pottery making of Zarubensi culture. Most classical authors define the Bastarne as either the Celts or the Germans, and thus the real ethnic background of this tribal group still remains uncertain. Anyway, it is highly doubtful that members of this tribal group referred to themselves as Bastarne. This supposition may be partially confirmed by the Tacitus evidence in Germania, speaking about the Peucini, who were known to be a branch of Bastarne. Tacitus stresses that the Peucini were called by some Bastarne. The Bastarne ethnicon was more likely a generic term used by Greek and Roman authors to describe a mixed Western-like barbarian community which emerged in the lands of Scythia in the early 2nd century BC. There are some interesting archaeological finds that reflect the cultural transitions between the Balkans, North Pontic area, and Northern Europe in the 1st century BC. About a dozen exceptionally rich warrior graves were excavated in Mutin, its Sumy region, far in the northeast of Ukraine. They present a distinct combination of Zarubensi culture elements and some features of Jastorf and Przeworsk culture. All these burials are dated to the late 1st century BC. The graves contained 13 late Latin swords and other military equipment. The most impressive finds are 5 late Latin helmets. At least 2 of them belong to the Novo Mesto type, which were produced during the 1st century BC by the Celtic Tauriski in today's Slavonia. Finds of such helmets from outside the Middle Danube region are rare. However, one of them was found in the Przeworsk grave from Shemiechów in Poland. 3 others came from the Sarmatian burials of Azov Sea area. Another intriguing artifact comes from the Przeworsk grave in Gryniv in the upper Dniester area. It was a rich warrior burial which is dated to the early decades of the 1st century AD. The burial rite of this grave display interesting mixture of the late Latin, Przeworsk, and Velbark traditions. The most notable artifact from the burial is the bronze plate of scabbard, decorated with the cutout, anthropomorphic, and zoomorphic figures in the open work style. Some parallels to the Gryniv's bronze plate decoration can be found in different artistic traditions. The scene with a beast of prey and a bird appears on the Phalar from the Isle of Sark in the English Channel. The image of the horseman from the Gryniv scabbard is undoubtedly of Thracian origin. It is almost identical to the raider figure from the Letnica silver plate. By contrast, the closest analogies to the eagle-headed griffin features and proportions of the human figures as well as floral elements come from the silver plates of the Gundestrup cauldron, which most probably combines the elements of the Balkan and Celtic iconography, technologies, and materials. The warrior graves from Mutin and Gryniv, as well as some other finds, give reasons to suggest that there was a significant cultural transitions and movements of individuals, ideas, and technologies between the southern Baltic area, North Pontic area, and the Celtic enclaves in Balkan region. So the question is how all these cultural transactions came into being. To my opinion, the answer could be found in the Historia Naturalis by Pliny the Elder. This part of his book, the book 4, is devoted to geography of Europe. And the Pliny's text is a kind of an itinerary, which has its starting and ending points in the Straits of Gades, or Gibraltar, as we know it today. Pliny's writings are based on the accounts of some earlier geographers and travelers. He describes the Mediterranean littoral, Italy, Alps and Balkans, islands of Ionian Sea. Then he pays his attention to Hellespont, Dacia, Sarmatia and Scythia. But the most interesting for us is the part of his book in which Pliny proposes his reader to leave the Black Sea, cross Riphean mountains, and come into the Northern Ocean or Baltic Sea, where numerous islands lay opposite the shores of Scythia. He describes his way from southeast to northwest in terms of boat journey. In next chapters of his work, Pliny describes the lands of Cimbri, Germania, Gallia, and Britain. Now let's have a look at the map. There is no doubt that Riphean mountains are actually Carpathians, because there are no other mountains lying between the Black and Baltic Seas. Pliny mentions Vistula River as a kind of a natural boundary of this region, which is populated by Sarmatians, Venedi, Sciri, and Hiri. But as far as Pliny describes his way from southeast to northwest, it means that Sarmatians were first to be met, then came Venedi, Sciri, and Hiri, and the latter probably occupied the shores of the Baltic Sea. Finally, the one can admit that the Celtic-looking names mentioned by Claudius Ptolemy are located exactly on the waterway from Baltic to Black Seas, as well as such important archaeological sites as Bovshev workshop and Griniv burial that were mentioned above. If to speak about the Celtic presence in the lands of today's Ukraine, one must admit that the situation differed significantly depending on the region. There was a group of settlements and burials which occupied the Transcarpathian region during the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC. It was a rather typical subgroup of the Latin culture, similar to those in nearby regions of Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania. In the lands eastward of Carpathians, there are some traces of Celtic military raids and micro-migrations of craftsmen, mercenaries, and women. However, they had no significant influence on the cultural situation. In the lands of today's Ukraine, the Greeks and Romans mentioned the Celtocytaeans or Bastarne to identify the western-looking population of this region, people of Scythia who looked like Celts or Germans because of their appearance, military traditions, and so on. And they were right, at least to some extent, because this population used material culture very similar to the Celtic or Latin one. We used to label this population as the Eastern Germanic. However, if we take into account Claudius Ptolemy evidence, we should acknowledge that there were some groups of population in the lower Danube and Dniester areas that either spoke Celtic dialects or, more likely, considered them prestigious enough to use them for naming their settlements and tribal groups. There are lots of evidence that the so-called Latinized cultures that flourished in the Eastern Europe from the 2nd century BC to the early 1st century AD were influenced by both Germanic Jastorf or Oxivia cultures and the cultures of the Balkan Celts. It was possible because there was a road which passed from the lower Danube area and northwest Black Sea littoral through the Dniester and Vistula basins to the Baltic Sea. It was used for exchanging individuals, artifacts, ideas, and technologies between southern, eastern, and northern Europe. 3 centuries later, the Goths used this road to migrate from the Baltic littoral to the North Pontic area. But it is completely another story. So thank you for your attention.